Today we're going to continue on in the book of Colossians, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but in major cities like London and Paris and New York, Los Angeles, Montreal, and even now in Vancouver, you can have this experience, unique experience of dining in a whole new way. It's completely in the dark. That's right. You can experience a culinary journey through uncharted territory with familiar food and drinks and friends in the utter darkness. No lights at all. Not from your cell phone or a flashlight or even your smartwatch. None of that is allowed in the dining room. Much of the staff are blind or visually impaired, and they help guide you through this experience as you allow your sense of sight to disappear and your senses of touch, taste, hearing, and smell be intensified. You enjoy a first-class meal in this very unique experience. And I look forward someday to going to Vancouver or where else? Montreal or Paris. I mean, we're going to Italy tomorrow, so maybe we can just take a short flight to Paris and experience this amazing experience. And most of you know that my grandfather was blind for half of his life, and so maybe this is just a little taste of what he experienced. At times, it can feel like we are in the dark of being able to fully know who God is. We might feel much like I can imagine I would feel unable to see anything, trying to find my glass of water without spilling it. It's hard enough when I can see, but completely maybe impossible when you can't see. Or your knife to cut your food, and where is your food anyway? Or your napkin, or so many things. I have questions about how I would even be able to accomplish eating a meal in the darkness when it feels difficult enough to eat a meal and not get something on me when I can see. But sometimes I feel that we are in the dark about God, trying to comprehend His fullness, who God is, His all-knowing power, His omnipresence, never able to escape Him, His goodness, His love, His discipline, mercy, and even when we fail, He loves us. It's a challenge for us to comprehend God's fullness, isn't it? And this morning we continue in our series through the book of Colossians entitled Fruits and Roots is the title of this series. Paul writes this letter from a cell in prison. And he writes this to a young church wanting to encourage them and pray for them and help them grow in their maturity as they settle in to being a new community of believers. And after a warm welcome in chapter 1, and he gives us this prayer for them, that he's praying for them and he's not forgotten about them, he goes into this poem-like description of who God is in the person of Jesus, which will help us come out of the dark room and see the fullness of God in the person of Jesus. So let me read Colossians 1:15 to 23. If you have it on your phone or your Bibles, you can pull it up, or it'll be on the screen. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your mind because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, not moving from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. If there was any doubt about where Paul was or where the early church was about believing who Jesus is, it's clearly answered, I think, in this poem. And it's really unclear if Paul wrote this poem or if he just used it as part of his own. But think about this. Paul's only about 20 years removed from the death of Jesus. 20 years. Now, that's more than 5. But 20 years is really not that long. And Paul was a different person 20 years ago. He hated Christians. He persecuted Christians. He did everything in his power to stop them. And yet you fast forward 20 years, and here's Paul risking his life in prison, willing to die for Jesus, for the church. So that road to Damascus experience that Paul went through, his journey of faith that has brought him to this point, has changed him and transformed him. And now he explains with great detail what he thinks about who Jesus is. That he is God in plain sight. And Paul helps lift the curtain of darkness about who God is as he shows the church, the early church, the fullness of God in the person of Jesus. Now I can think back 20 years and probably could say I'm a fairly different person than I was 20 years ago. In fact, I think it'll be about 20 years in August that I showed up here as a candidate, as a youth pastor here at First Baptist Church. And so I'd like to think I've changed since then, and it's not just the amount of hair that's on my head, Cheryl, and I took a little bit of offense that only old people were going to be there tomorrow, that were going to be bald and white, and I'm bald and white, so, and I'm only 47, so. But it's amazing for me to think about Paul and his context, not only his own personal journey to faith, and where he's come from, but also as Paul writes this poem, he's writing from Rome. Rome is the home of Caesar. It is the base of the Roman government. And Caesar, if we know anything about Caesar, Caesar believed that he was God-like and he demanded worshiping. That all citizens of Rome worshiped Caesar. And equally, the Roman Empire was demanded worship and loyalty. Now, we don't have statues all over our country of our prime minister, thankfully. But imagine if we did, and we were expected to go and worship the prime minister. That was Rome. There were statues of Caesar everywhere. And as a citizen, you were expected to go and worship Caesar. You were expected to be loyal to Rome. And they demanded full and total submission and loyalty. And if you stepped out of line, well, we know what that looks like because there were crosses on hills everywhere you went. And if you stepped out of line, your punishment often was the cross. And Jesus took that punishment and flipped it on its head, and used that for victory. And Paul says, when he proclaims that Jesus is the visible image of God, he's also saying that Caesar is not, and should not be considered in the same likeness of God. When he talks about the supremacy of God, he's saying that Rome and Caesar are not, that they don't compare in the power and the knowledge and reign of the true living God. Even though Jesus was born to a young couple, probably not even married yet, in a remote part of Palestine, died a criminal's death, he, Paul says, is far greater than Rome and Caesar will ever be. Jesus is the only one worth following. And it is in him that we find and know and understand the true God, who is in control of all things and sustains all things. We also need to be reminded that the church that he writes to are young believers. They come from all different kinds of backgrounds. Some of them worshiped idols and false gods, other philosophies that were important and prominent during that time. Some of them had no idea who Jesus was or how expansive his reign is without Paul and Timothy and Epaphras explaining it to them. And so when Paul writes this poem, he leaves no doubt that Jesus is the fullness of God in plain sight, and it is to him that we do have our loyalty, him and him alone. His power does not come lording it over people like Caesar or demanding worship, but by humility and love. Jesus' reign is one that's of humility over all creation from protons to neutrons, however that works, to plants and animals, to government leaders, to the whole of the universe on earth as it is in heaven. He is in control, and it's under his guidance. So what Jesus accomplished on the cross, on a criminal's cross, is far greater than just our own personal salvation. It changed the course of history. All things, all people, all nations, all rulers are subject to his reign. And he holds all things together. So when I wonder about how a convicted felon can still run for a presidency, I think about this verse, or how a mass murderer can run free out of the control and control governments. I think of this verse. And though it's wrong, I come back to Colossians 1 and think of Jesus' ruling power. Though I still feel like I'm a little bit in the dark about how Jesus will bring all of this together for his glory, he will. Because he is in control. And he will work through all people and all things and all nations. Because he already reigns and rules over heaven and earth. See, Jesus' death on the cross was about reconciling all things to himself. Even felons and murderers. Even us, who at one point were far away from God. We were naturally enemies of God, Paul says, of Jesus. That the plague of sin that runs rampant in our world, we were on that side at one point, needing his love and his mercy to be brought back into the family of God. No matter how good of a life we lived, nobody is able to save themselves. We were enemies of Jesus. But through Jesus' death on the cross, he has opened that door for all things and for all people to be brought into his loving care. So if we want we want to, and if the early church wants to continue to grow in faith and in maturity, we need to hear Paul's words. This is more than just a great poem. It's more than just Paul showing off what he believes or how well he can put it together in just a few sentences. The way to continue to grow and understand is to embrace this fully into our lives, the centrality and supremacy of Jesus. Jesus is the head, the firstborn from all creation, the one whom we gain wisdom and understanding. He is God in visible form. He is our example, not just in faith, but in how we live out every day of our life. He is the standard as we grow in faith and wisdom. Faith and wisdom in a world that is less and less Christian. Jesus is here to guide us and direct us. And we should take our cues from him and no one else. No one else compares to Jesus. So early on in this letter to the Colossians, Paul roots the early church in the understanding that Jesus is God in plain sight. That this poem is something to be lived out each and every day. And as we understand what Paul is saying, we get a glimpse. The veil of darkness is raised, and we can see a little bit more of God's grand plan of creation, where all things are reconciled to him. And our role is to help Jesus along that way. The resurrection of Jesus points us to a new life here and now, a new creation found in him to be lived out, where we have received forgiveness and love and mercy, and we are to pass it on to others so that we can show God in plain sight. See, God is not far off from us. He is not unconcerned with our world. He is present and active, and we've sang about it this morning. He's moving in this place. He's moving in us and in his church. And nobody is too far away from God's love and grace found in Jesus, his Son, and found in Jesus, the Son. So this week, may we allow these words of Paul about Jesus to sink deeply into our head and into our heart, into our lives, as we come out of the darkness into understanding the fullness of God found completely in the person of Jesus.